Chapter 251. I also don't know its origin. It might be a collection of Odin himself. At least in my long life, I have never heard of anything similar. As for that gray mist, it should be the grudge left by the primordial giant after his death. It was supposed to turn into a curse, but in the end, Odin trapped it here. The primordial giant Ymir in Scandinavian mythology is a character similar to a creator deity. However, the only significance of this creator deity is to give birth to a host of titans and the deity race and then be killed. Even dwarves and elves are transformations derived from his body after his death. Lane's fingers lightly tapped the steel, but he found nothing, so he had to put it aside for now. As for the gray mist, there was also no use for it yet, so he simply gathered it up as well. In the end, Lane looked at the head of Mimir, this giant from another world he had brought back to the spirit realm. The other party also looked at him somewhat nervously, knowing that his role to play had now come to an end. I took you away from Asgard and you solved my doubts. Now we're even. Do you have anything else you want to say? Lane asked calmly, looking at the head that was half the height of a human. He didn't need such a head to act as his staff, but he also had no plans to let it go. After all, Mimir had witnessed all his gains along the way, so it was better to stay in the spirit realm. And although he was now very obedient to him, 9 times out of 10, he was not an honest fellow. If possible, I'd like to stay within the spirit realm and do some things as a form of repayment, the head proposed. As a head without the power to resist, Mimir knew nothing of chaos. He only knew that the place he was staying in was the spirit realm, the kingdom of the deity standing before him, just as Odin was to Asgard. Although Lane had been quite polite along the way, Mimir gauged by himself that the other party probably wouldn't let him go freely. Moreover, he didn't think he'd be better off outside as just a head. However, I hope to acquire a body that can walk, rather than always staying like this. To stay is of course possible, and as for what to do, since you were once a giant of wisdom, go and take care of knowledge. I'll build a library on the 3rd floor of the spirit realm, and you'll be the gatekeeper. In your spare time, you can also compile your past memories into books and store them there. As for a body, after a moment of thought, Lane finally gave a very interesting reply. Your body will be up to you to obtain. I'll open that library to outsiders. Whoever puts knowledge into it will be able to take out knowledge of equal value. You may not harm any being that comes to the door, and of course they cannot harm you either. That's the rule I've set. However, you may exchange with them. As long as you do not intentionally deceive them, and they willingly lend you their body, then you can become the master of that body. It's quite fair, isn't it? You're right. I am willing to accept this outcome. Though somewhat disappointed, this was already quite good. Compared to forever being just a head in the Golden Palace, Mimir now at least had a chance to move. He only hoped that more people would come to this library in the future rather than not seeing a single soul for years. Very well, since you've agreed, the deal is now made. I'll come to visit you when I have time, agreed Lane. Nodding, Lane extended a hand and pointed. In the Severus Temple on Mount Sinai, within the divine artifact storing the memories of all creatures of the 4th layer of the all-spirit realm, countless forms of knowledge were extracted and then transformed into volumes of books. Acting under the influence of an invisible force, they systematically arranged themselves into a spontaneously formed, circular library, distributed in a spiral fashion with no visible end above or below. During this process, the skull of Mimir was also brought into the main hall of the circular library, wherefrom it became the steward of this place. With a simple wave of the hand, the library vanished within folding space, and then reappeared in a certain spot on the 3rd layer of the spirit realm. A destiny-driven attraction was placed upon it, so that from then on, any life form seeking certain knowledge might unintentionally find their way here, leaving behind their own and acquiring what they sought. With this, the miscellaneous tasks were complete, and Lane's gaze finally fell upon the dragon eggs he had brought back. As a deity who had personally created more than one life, Lane easily discerned the unique characteristics of these dragon eggs. They were still unformed, constantly susceptible to change by the shifting conditions of the exterior environment. If Lane hadn't isolated them from the interaction with the spirit realm's essence, this transformation might have already begun. Undoubtedly, the better the environment, the stronger the power absorbed during the incubation process, and correspondingly, the newborn dragons would be stronger. In fact, even their progeny would inherit this enhanced strength. As the core of the spirit realm, Mount Sinai was indeed already an excellent nurturing environment, but the power of the spirit realm itself was quite chaotic. If left to gestate on their own, Lane was unsure what breed of dragon would ultimately emerge. In such circumstances, the question of how to shape these dragon eggs with more specificity became a matter worth considering. If we were to discuss strength and purity, indeed the powers of spirituality, samsara, and order were the most suitable within the spirit realm, but order was not exclusive to Lane within chaos, and for some reason, samsara was not fit to become the primal power of the new dragon race. Thus, looking at the two most vibrant dragon eggs before him, Lane undoubtedly needed to find another appropriate authority. And after much consideration, one incomplete creation seemed to be the perfect choice. Time. I have held it for quite a while, and the divine artifact it is to give birth to has yet to appear. At least another epoch is required for it to be born as a Genesis artifact, which couldn't be more suitable. To grant an authority its corresponding race would undoubtedly aid its evolution and refinement. Besides, time was, after all, one of the few origins in the spirit realm closest to the Great Plains, apart from spirituality, order, and samsara. Both in terms of strength and potential for development, it deserves to be one of the choices. Since that is the case, lucky fellow, you shall be the world's first time dragon. With a touch, one of the two dragon eggs instantaneously shifted positions, appearing next to a dark gold light cluster within the depths of the mountain. An embryonic divine artifact that had been nurtured for an epoch. The power of time began to impregnate the dragon egg, adding dark golden stripes to it, while the breath of life was also brought forth. Simultaneously, the power of the spirit realm began to cleanse the dragon egg's origin, transforming it thoroughly into a member of the spirit realm while it was still unborn. The moment before the emergence of life is the best chance to change its source. The divine artifact and the dragon will complement each other. In the future, the time dragons will navigate through the intervals of time, harvesting fragments of time to return to the embryonic divine artifact or directly influencing significant events, creating historical nodes, thereby expediting the birth of the divine artifact. Conversely, the stronger the embryonic divine artifact is, the more complete the time authority of the spirit realm, the more powerful the time dragon race will also become. There may be many dragon breeds in the future, but Lane believes that the time dragons bound to the Genesis artifact will undoubtedly be among the most powerful. As for those with slightly weaker auras, they may be shaped at will, contributing to the diversity of the world's dragon race. After all, bearing power also requires potential, and apart from those two most excellent ones, even if Lane could find suitable authorities, they would only be like Odin, who was unable to bear the complete rune scriptures. Their power would still only be a fraction of the whole.
Chapter 252 Surveillance.
Time cannot be altered at will, and the more powerful the world is, the more this is the case, especially when it involves powerful beings. Thus, before reaching a certain height, the difficulty and cost of killing the past, to then kill the now far outweighs directly taking down one's enemy head-on. Therefore, although future time dragons can travel through past and future, they cannot arbitrarily change what has already occurred. They can observe the future but cannot determine which future is the true one, or if none of the futures they see are the real ones, it is merely a negligible possibility that cannot even qualify as a prophecy. They can glimpse into the past, but it feels more like watching a film, and if the entities involved surpass their own power by too much, it could even cause the film to blur. However, this is only limited to the main body of chaos. After all, there are too many deities here, and the laws are too strict. If it were somewhere else, it should be much easier. Lane's gaze pierced through layers of obstruction to see beyond the present world, into the void within it. As a deity who had deeply participated in the fusion of the 9 realities with the world, even without actively engaging in prophecy, fate still provided him with feedback. He vaguely noticed that the small fragments of the 9 realms that were initially absorbed by chaos had already begun evolving. As time passed, they might become scattered miniature planes, attached to the main body of the world. Compared to the present world, those miniature planes have weaker regulations and are less likely to give birth to powerful life forms. For those places devoid of higher powers, time dragons undoubtedly can do as they please. Without any surprises, those places will be their main activity grounds in the future. After all, as dragons, they are already strong enough. But in the chaos world, it is the gods who are the masters of the world. And then there's you. Lane turned to look at another dragon egg. It did not need to worry about such things. Spirituality in itself is the most suitable power for it. What really matters, instead, is how much it can withstand. His palm lightly caressed the surface of the dragon egg, and in an instant, the originally pitch-black shell turned white, its entire body shifting from a solid entity to a more ethereal state. The purest spirituality flowed continuously from Lane's fingertips into the dragon egg, providing power for the dragon within that has yet to be born. It began to shed its material state, transitioning towards a form between ethereal and physical. Once the transformation is complete, it will possess not only the mighty body common to all dragons, but will also be able to travel between mind and consciousness, command elements, and foresee the future. Of course, this is limited to itself. Being the first, it's always a bit more special, while its kin may not necessarily have these abilities. Suddenly, Lane unexpectedly discovered that perhaps because the spirituality significantly enhanced the consciousness of the dragon egg, even before being born, it had already gained a hazy ability to think. It started conveying a vague message, roughly seeking a name. Originally, as creations of Nidhogg, each dragon would possess a piece of information from him, which would serve as their unique name for the future, a moniker that's also one of their anchors. But now, the dragon egg, transformed by the spirit realm, was stripped of this influence, and thus it instinctively sought a name. You want a name? Let's not rush the official one, since you haven't been born yet. For now you'll be called Ba. Looking at the eggshell that had turned white, Lane said offhand. The dragon egg, whether satisfied or not, simply wobbled twice. Then I'll take it that you're happy with it. With a slight smile, as the two dragon eggs began to be nurtured one after the other, certain rules within the spirit realm changed along with them. Lane did not plan to make these two mighty true dragons into roles similar to the dragon mother, but since there was only one of each, they naturally required a different method to produce kin. Lane thought it quite simple. The birth was to be bootstrapped. Henceforth, the kin of these two dragon eggs would not be born through reproduction, but instead through the convergence of time and spirituality. They might appear anywhere. More likely, they would directly manifest within dead eggs of other dragons, taking their place entirely. However, these weaker kin, compared to the kings of their respective tribes, will inevitably fall short. For example, the future kin of Bai will only have powers related to the mind, with elements and destiny being beyond their reach. For this reason, Lane named them uniquely Mind Dragons. It seems it won't be a brief period of time. Well, let's just wait. There is still some time before the dragon eggs are born, but this is not long for a deity, and if the passage of time here is accelerated, then it is expected that Bai can hatch before the extinction of bronze humanity. Thus, Lane gently lifted his hand, warping the flow of time on Mount of the Gods. Since that's the case, he plans to wait for a decade or two. After the dragon nurtured by spirituality is born, he'll then consider its much weaker siblings. During this gap, he took out the fragmented weapon of Odin, the shaft of the divine lance Gungnir. A dozen years, within the distorted spacetime, should be sufficient for him to handle this treasure from the other world. Lane had no intention to repair or preserve the divine artifact, since without its penetrative spearhead, Gungnir's innate power wasn't of much significance to him. For it, Lane had a different use in mind. Chapter 253. Mount Olympus, Divine King's sleeping chamber. It had been quite some time since the punishment of humans, and Zeus, seated on a chair in his palace, gently massaged his temples. His headaches had become more noticeable in recent days. The Divine King knew what this was about. His daughter was about to come of age, eager to come into this world. Yet as a deity, she needed a process, a birth. But Zeus, after all, was not a goddess. He couldn't possibly give birth to her, and so her power began to conflict with her father's. Regarding this matter, Zeus indeed was not without a solution. As an immortal member of the deity race, and not human, he could simply open up his body to allow her to be born. However, in reality, the divine king wasn't very eager for her to emerge. Just as the prophecy had said, one who will surpass the mother, one who will surpass the father, this unborn child not only divided most of Métis's wisdom, making Zeus feel his own thoughts were not as clear as before, but this newborn also possessed other divine authorities. Undoubtedly, all this foretold that she would be an extremely powerful true god. But this made Zeus rather apprehensive. After all, if such a daughter were obedient, well and good, but should she harbor resentment towards him for swallowing Métis, she might well become another enemy. And on the other hand, the divine king thought of the wisdom that had not been bestowed upon humans not long ago. Could it be that this daughter, even before being born, had already seen something? Perhaps she refused her father's command over the authority because she didn't want wisdom to become a cause of human destruction? Perhaps I'm overthinking it, he said. No god could understand the affairs of the outside world before being born. Shaking his head slightly, Zeus seemed to want to scatter his worries. With his brothers and sisters as a contrast, Zeus was quite clear on what an unborn god could do. Perhaps her refusal of his command over the authority was just a coincidence, or maybe it was an instinctual reaction of the divine authority of wisdom. Zephyrus, pushing aside his thoughts, with the current situation indicating that the child wouldn't be born immediately, Zeus prepared to deal with the affairs that had accumulated in recent days. With Zeus's call, a breeze passed by, and the god of the west wind, who had been relied upon heavily by the two rains' divine king, appeared before him. "Your Majesty, what are your orders?" Zephyrus asked in a respectful tone. "How has it gone with the matter I had you attend to?" Though everything had been arranged, Zeus felt he was far from the point of resting easy. He wasn't like he would be later. There were many beings in the world he still had to be wary of. Therefore, soon after the gods had departed, he had the West Wind god investigate the changes in the human tribes and the attitude of the afterthinker, Epimetheus, like whether he held any grudges against the divine king. And most importantly, he had this keen spying deity track the goddess of the magic net, Hecate. In the current mortal realm, she was the greatest uncertainty. After all, Zeus vividly remembered how, when they had once clashed, this goddess was not yet a deity. To defeat a fully powered true god without borrowing divine powers, even though he had been very weak at that time, was still quite remarkable. "Your Majesty, I may still lack in strength, but in this regard, nobody can compare with me." Zephyrus spoke with unwavering respect, yet his words betrayed immense confidence. As one who had secretly spied on the Lord of the Spirit Realm, the Lady of the Night, and Mother Earth, not even the divine king could compare to him in this aspect. Moreover, with the current gods' divine powers limited on Earth, their perceptual abilities had further declined. Under such circumstances, Zephyrus didn't believe anyone could detect his presence. "Your Majesty, humans are as arrogant as ever. Even though the gods have already spared them, they still deceive their own kind in the name of divinity, compelling obedience to their commands, such laughable mortals. However, I've noticed that under the deception of those who call themselves priests, the faith of mortals doesn't seem to have diminished much despite the loss of divine gifts. Sure, some have become faithless, but many have become even more devout." At this, Zephyrus appeared somewhat perplexed. While he could see the outcome, he didn't understand the reason why some humans' faith in the gods grew stronger despite the absence of blessings. And what of Epimetheus? Without explaining his thoughts, Zeus expected this. Mortals were, after all, different from gods. In dealing with them, one couldn't just bestow favors unthinkingly. As he listened to the wind god's report, Zeus's mind once again cast back to that person who had prayed to him for immortality, yet lacked even a sliver of faith. That mortal's name was something like something, but that was no longer important. His soul would be eternally imprisoned in that charred husk. enduring endless pain and the torment of lightning. In a sense, this was somewhat a form of immortality. Your Majesty, that god of hindsight is as foolish as the rumors say. I even overheard him mentioning that just before Prometheus left, he advised him to stay away from the divine court and humans, yet he did not heed his brother's words. He and that god-made creature live quite well together, even having a daughter, Zephyrus said with a touch of disdain in his voice, thinking that if only Epimetheus were half as clever as himself, he wouldn't have ended up a pawn completely unaware. Chapter 254. Where is that clay jar sent by the king of the underworld? Zeus didn't pay much attention to Epimetheus. He only had the god of west wind look after him as a precaution. What truly concerned Zeus was the king of the underworld's gift. Hades volunteered to bear the name of the destroyer of the bronze humanity. As long as someone defied his warning and opened the jar he gave, the gods under his command would use plague and calamity to resolve Zeus's troubles. As for the price, he demanded that from now on, the corpses of all who did not devoutly believe in the gods would belong to him, and the divine king agreed to this request. However, for some reason, his ambitious but incompetent elder brother also got involved. Poseidon declared that he too wanted to take part in the destruction of humanity. Zeus felt that he probably thought such an act would make humans fear his power. But had he not considered that gods were not just him alone? Hades resided in the underworld, possessed authority which was also not favored by humans. Giving up a positive image could be understood, but Poseidon. Yet thinking about it, it seemed hard to say his choice was wrong. After all, his own elder brother probably wasn't very capable of playing the role of a majestic and just benevolent deity. The gift bestowed by His Majesty the King of the Underworld is well preserved by Epimetheus and Pandora. They did nothing unnecessary, merely occasionally taking it out to look at it, Zephyrus reported, standing before Zeus. I understand. I'll handle this matter. After pondering for a moment, since simple curiosity and the desire to explore could be suppressed by reason, then Zeus decided to add the sin of envy as well. He believed that he and the 3 daughters of Eurynomy could very well accomplish this. Besides that jar, the divine king was actually quite interested in the gift from the goddess of the nether moon as well. What about Hecate? What has she gone off to do? In the end, the divine king turned his attention to that unstable factor. He still couldn't discern Hecate's attitude towards him, nor had he understood how she managed to weave the magic net. But she possessed a powerful divine artifact, with a force unlike that of any deity. That much was clear to Zeus. That goddess of the magic net, she and the moon goddess Selene went to the ruins of Mount Othrys. They seemed to be doing something there, and after they left I went there to have a look, Zephyrus said after hesitating. Since I couldn't use divine power, I was unable to break through the barrier left by that goddess. It seemed to be connecting the mountain and the land to the magic net, so I couldn't tell what they did. After that, they headed off to the celestial spaces. No matter, it's normal for you not to be able to deal with what she left behind. In the present world, there are few deities who can trouble her. Zeus was reasonably satisfied, as long as Hecate didn't wander around on the land at this juncture. It would be trouble if she suddenly took an interest in the bronze humanity. You've done well. I will grant you the right to spread faith among the humans on your own when the next generation is born. This is an early reward for you. In the meantime, you are still responsible for monitoring the human tribes in the vicinity. As you command, Your Majesty. Zephyrus wore a happy expression, knowing what Zeus's promise meant. Now, the faith of humans towards the Olympian pantheon was in a situation akin to a big pot meal, where any powerful deity who knew the secret of faith built temples of varying standards and sizes among the human tribes, based on their divine power. But in the next era Zeus had envisioned, this would not be the case. The gods were far from harmonious, and if Zeus forced them to coexist peacefully, the contradictions would only target him, the divine king. It was better to let them fight amongst themselves. Moreover, some gods, though powerful, lacked in wisdom like Poseidon. Zeus felt that if left to his own devices, he wouldn't be able to gather any followers. So, he let the gods reap what they sowed. Furthermore, with the faith and deceit of the bronze humanity, The gods gradually realized that the devotion generated by humans who primarily worship one deity while merely respecting others was far greater than that of those who worshipped many gods simultaneously, which further intensified their desire to split apart. Ironically, this discovery was also the path to death for Prometheus, because the gods noticed the phenomenon due to some humans only worshipping the creator, with their faith in other gods being superficial. However, all of this was originally unrelated to the god of West Wind. In the Divine King's plans, only those deities of significant importance in the divine court had the privilege to spread their faith alone in the next age of humanity, and Zephyrus' status was rather awkward. Although he became the leader of the wind gods with the enhancement of the Divine King's power, taking over many responsibilities originally belonging to the god of meteorology, and barely stepped into intermediate divine power, theoretically a member of the higher gods, this power could be revoked by the Divine King at any time. Now, having received Zeus's promise, he finally was able to breathe a sigh of relief. After receiving his orders, the god of West Wind left the palace, transforming into a current of air and disappearing without a trace. Behind him, Zeus also nodded silently. The authority of the wind gods was indeed handy for gathering information, as even if divine power was restrained on the land, it could not prevent a deity from transforming into the essence of their godhood. It seemed that neither Hecate nor Epimetheus must have noticed his surveillance. In this respect, the goddess of Rainbow Iris, who often conveyed his orders as well, was not just a notch below. So, in recent years, the Divine King had sent her to serve the Heavenly Empress rather than always staying by his side. Hopefully, nothing unexpected occurs. I also don't know where that intuition of mine came from. Just before, around the time Prometheus was confined to the East Sea, Zeus felt somewhat restless, which is why he accelerated his plans. He was so eager to create Pandora and send her to Epimetheus that he seemed a bit hasty. However, soon after, as the master of Olympus, the Divine King once again had a mysterious hunch. He felt as if something was approaching Mount Olympus, and there was a tight connection between it and him. As a result, Zeus spent a lot of time meticulously exploring, but in the end, he found nothing. Perhaps I should try a different approach. Maybe intuition can lead me to the target better than divine power. With a slight change in his expression, Zeus decided that once the matter of the bronze humanity was concluded, he would let his instincts guide him to see what had triggered his reaction. As the 9 realms integrated and Prometheus was imprisoned, the chaos world once again became calm. Or rather, having continuous events like in recent years was unprecedented in the past 2 eras. Years sped by, and everything appeared so tranquil, with only a few able to sense the undercurrent beneath this calm. Until this day, when several divine visitors from Mount Olympus came to the valley where Epimetheus and Pandora resided. Chapter 255 Awakening. The sun chariot had already reached the west, and the afterglow of the sunset painted the earth with a layer of golden varnish. The Afterthinker's residence wasn't far from the human tribes, yet it was separated by a wide river. This river had been born at the turn of an era, as a result of the residual effects of 2 ancient gods clashing. Hence, it had no river god. Instead, a double-headed beast tainted with the blood of the sea god occupied it. Under the intimidation of the beast, there were no traces of human activity in this place, even though it was only separated by one river. But today, 3 distinct-looking but splendidly dressed goddesses arrived here. They were clad in gemstone-studded gowns, crowns of flowers on their heads, and holding bouquets, radiating an aura of beauty and joy. When they stood together, even the deserted riverbank seemed like the site of a winding streamside feast, eliciting a sense of heartfelt pleasure. Aglaea, why did Father God make us visit a mortal? With a slightly arrogant expression, Talia complained to her youngest sister. She is not a mortal, Talia. She is Pandora, blessed by all the gods. With a serene smile, Aglaea quietly explained. What's the difference? She was created by gods and so were humans. Does being blessed by the gods make her divine? Feeling unconvinced, Talia, the oldest and most mature-looking among them, actually knew that Pandora was not just any mortal, but regardless, she could not be considered a god's equal. Yet such a person had received a blessing from all the gods, something she had never enjoyed. Let it go, Talia. Regardless, she has married a deity. Perhaps Father God wants us to express his benevolence, especially since both the foolish god's brothers have been punished by the divine court sequentially. Euphrosyne stopped Talia's complaints. The three Graces, daughters of the Oceanide Eurynomy, were respectively in charge of elegance and splendor, mirth and festivity, encouragement and enjoyment. From a certain perspective, they seemed to represent the beauty of different female age stages. The youngest, Aglaea, was graceful and quiet, often preferring solitude to admire the beauty of mountains and rivers. Euphrosyne, the second, enjoyed a more lively atmosphere, frequently bringing smiles to those around her. Talia, the eldest, was no longer satisfied with ordinary pleasures. She presided over indulgence and feasting, bringing more thrilling enjoyment to everyone. Perhaps for this reason, the eldest one appeared somewhat fond of comparison, while the youngest was much more polite. Humph! With a huff, Talia accepted Euphrosyne's reasoning. Despite her disdain for Epimetheus, he was at least a descendant of the Titans, and both his brothers were renowned among the gods for their wisdom and strength, and he himself possessed considerable divine power. Though this considerable was only so when compared to the three of them, in the current age, true gods with lesser divine power were indeed rare. Ending their brief spat, the three goddesses walked towards the distant garden. This garden, built by Epimetheus for Pandora, surrounded their dwelling. "Oh, you are!" Approaching unconcealed, the Graces startled the lady at home, Pandora, who was wearing a spacious robe. She looked up from the flower bed and gazed into the distance. As embodiments of beauty, the three goddesses embodied different forms of beauty, despite their dissimilar appearances. And in this respect, Pandora, blessed by the true goddess of beauty, was not inferior. But compared to their lavish attire, her dress was much plainer. As Athena had not yet been born, the bright-eyed maiden, victorious in battles and skilled in crafts, naturally had no chance to cloak Pandora in a feathered dress. Thus, as the first mortal woman in the world, a sense of envy rose in Pandora's heart, which she quickly suppressed. She was a life blessed by the gods. A mere dress was not worth concerning herself with. "I am Aglaea, and these are my two sisters. We have come to visit the brother of the Forethinker," Aglaea said with a polite smile. "Then please come in, ladies. I have heard of your names. Unfortunately, Epimetheus left not long ago, saying he would be gone for quite some time." Stepping forward, Pandora opened the gate to the garden and spoke. "Is that so? That is indeed unfortunate." With a slight smile, Aglaea pulled her somewhat reluctant sister into the garden. Bright, vibrant flowers bloomed unseasonably along the sides of the path paved with fine stones, courtesy of Demeter's blessing, making Pandora's surroundings perpetually flourish with flowers, eternal like spring. Entering the garden, Aglaea casually started a conversation while observing the environment and layout. "On a daily basis, is it just you and Prince Epimetheus living here? It must feel a bit lonely." "Not just us. There's also my daughter Pytha, who was recently born. Furthermore, Deucalion often visits us." Pandora spoke of Deucalion with a hint of regret. "He did not inherit his parents' powers, and his divinity is almost non-existent. As a completely ordinary demigod, he also lives with us in the mortal realm." Chapter 256. The Forethinker Prometheus had a wife and child, though indeed, they weren't as well known as he was. He and the Oceanide, the goddess of foresight Pronoia, gave birth to Deucalion, yet this son of the Forethinker couldn't obtain any godhood. His power was not even much stronger than that of an ordinary mortal. Demigod, a term used sometimes to describe a state and other times to describe a race. And in this age, since the first mortal born with innate divinity had not yet come into being, demigod naturally refers to the latter. Any first-generation descendant of a deity can be called a demigod, and Deucalion was such an existence. Long before Prometheus attempted to deceive the gods, the goddess of foresight, like Epimetheus, had advised against it. However, unlike the afterthinker, when persuasion proved fruitless, Pronoia directly sought refuge in the reclusive abode of Iapetus, seeking the protection of this Titan deity. She did not return to the ocean because, after learning the secret of faith, Pronoia was no longer allowed to approach the sea. Deucalion, on the other hand, chose to stay behind, because he always believed in his father's wisdom. That is a real pity, but I believe he will, like his father, achieve his own with something other than strength. Having offered words of comfort, Aglaia resumed her conversation with Pandora, and her two sisters also joined them. The garden was already half traversed when suddenly, Talia seemed to remember something and couldn't help but ask, "Pandora, I heard Lord Hades gave you a jar?" "Yes, that's right. Do you want to take a look?" A smile played on her lips, for regarding this treasure bestowed by Hades, Pandora was understandably proud. Ever since he went to the underworld, Hades had interacted less with the gods above, but he still remembered to send her a gift, which was also a pleasing matter. "Of course, I've been curious about it for a long time." Nodding, Talia continued, "Is it true that another principal god of the underworld added an extra, very precious item into it at the time? A treasure, perhaps, but I also don't know what that might be." In her memory, what Liana had placed inside the jar was a shimmering illusion that was not quite clear. Thus Pandora could only shake her head. "Haven't you tried opening it to take a look?" Interest piqued, Talia couldn't help but suggest. Lord Hades cautioned that the jar must not be opened. Declining the idea, although Pandora was also curious about what exactly was hidden inside that allowed such an ordinary clay jar to absorb disaster and misfortune, she remembered the Divine King's injunction and had thus never made an unwarranted move. "I understand, but Hades did not explain why it cannot be opened, did he?" Not caring too much, in Talia's memory, nothing in the Chaos world prior existed that would bring disaster upon opening it. As for mortals, she truly had not thought about them. Maybe there's an even more precious treasure inside. Moreover, since the Divine King didn't prevent another principal god of the underworld from adding a gift, it must not contain any danger, I presume. Pandora was somewhat tempted, but she shook her head in refusal again, which made Talia a bit displeased. After gazing at the beautiful woman in front of her, she said indifferently, "That's right, after all, you're not of the deity race, and you inevitably have various concerns, but they are truly unnecessary. I wonder what purpose the Father God had in mind in having the gods create you. Perhaps, but as a goddess yourself, you don't seem to have made the gods regard you any differently. Why don't you go ask Lord Hades yourself what's really inside, to satisfy my curiosity as well?" Although she faced a deity, Pandora felt no fear. With the blessing given to her by Hestia, this deity with meager divine power simply couldn't trouble her. "You!" Talia's complexion didn't look very good, and for a moment, the atmosphere became awkward. Aglaia and Euphrosyne pulled her away, and the argument didn't continue. However, under such an atmosphere, the three Graces didn't stay much longer. They simply made a quick tour of the garden and then returned to Olympus. Fortunately, although Epimetheus was not present, the Divine King had sent them to visit Pandora. Thus the three goddesses themselves also felt they had fulfilled Zeus's request. Standing at the garden's entrance, Pandora watched the three figures leave, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. Talia's rudeness was certainly unpleasant, but there was a reason for her behavior. After all, women of wisdom in Chaos World were either deities or nymphs, and the nymphs' purpose was to serve as the servants of the gods. "What's wrong? Did something happen today?" Startled by the voice that suddenly rose behind her, Pandora quickly realized that the newcomer was Epimetheus. "Weren't you supposed to be out for quite a while? The gods from Mount Olympus came to visit you earlier. If they had known you'd be back now, they surely would have stayed a while longer." "That's unfortunate." He smiled lightly. Epimetheus glanced at the departing streaks of light in the sky and continued to ask, "What did you talk about with them?" The eldest of the three Graces, Talia, was curious about Hades' gift. "Lord Hades has explicitly said not to open it." Feeling somewhat aggrieved, Pandora hoped to find comfort from Epimetheus, but the result left her disappointed. Chapter 257. I actually think there's nothing wrong with opening it and taking a look, Epimetheus casually remarked with a radiant smile. Humph! With a snort, Pandora turned away from her foolish husband and headed towards the room. She didn't want to speak any further with Epimetheus. Behind her, the god of hindsight didn't get angry. He just smiled and followed Pandora into the room. The three Graces had left, but things didn't stop there. From that day on, for some reason, even though her two sisters showed little interest, Talia, uncharacteristically, often visited the residence of the god of hindsight to see her newly made good friend. For some reason, she hardly ever encountered Epimetheus. Each time, he would be away for various reasons, but this suited Talia just fine. After all, she wasn't there for the god of hindsight. She borrowed a golden crown from the heavenly empress, the scepter of wealth from the goddess of agriculture, had a garland made by the mother goddess, and even borrowed Aphrodite's belt, the divine artifact that could make all the opposite sex fall head over heels. Besides the goddess of law who was recently not in Olympus, she had visited almost every deity of some stature. Even she herself was somewhat surprised by the outcome. Whenever she made her requests, these powerful deities all agreed to lend her what she sought. Talia didn't give it much thought, though. She simply assumed it was out of respect for the divine king. Good things, naturally, should be shared. So, with each treasure she obtained, she would bring them to show her good friend Pandora. This behavior undoubtedly infuriated Pandora. She complained to her husband about it, but as the rumors among the gods suggested, the dull Epimetheus didn't realize Talia's nefarious intentions. Instead, he found it strange. Shouldn't it be a joyous occasion when a good friend comes to show you treasures? Feeling helpless, Pandora gave up on the idea of getting help from her husband. As a non-goddess with Olympus closed to her, and without the power to meet other deities, she grew even more angry. Time continued to flow, and within the tribes of humans, as well as among the deities, many changes occurred. Within Aurora City, tall walls had been erected, and people often dared to venture into the wilderness only in groups of 3 to 5, dressed in crude protective gear made from animal hides. But there were some who were different. One day, the priests at the top echelons of Aurora discovered unsettling elements within the city they governed. These individuals possessed physiques far superior to the carefully selected guards, able to kill fierce beasts with claws and fangs on their own. They gathered around a man named Cohen, listening to his tales of the Golden Age, the virtues of the golden humanity, and they followed his teachings to hone their bodies and combat skills. This surprising development left the priests greatly astonished. However, after consulting with the high priest Mammon, who dwelled beside the new sacred fire, the latter's response was ambiguous, seemingly with no intention of taking action. Some priests didn't understand why, but many more knew they had already become insiders with Mammon. The mysterious figure shrouded in black mist had warned them not to provoke that guy, so they all supported the high priest's decision. And thus, a strange phenomenon arose. An apparently uncontrolled small group emerged within Aurora City, yet curiously, it was overlooked by the city's administrators. In this context, both parties did not interfere with each other's affairs, each busying themselves with their own tasks. However, unlike the priests, Cohen, despite being immersed in various affairs, did not feel happy. All along the way, his steadfast beliefs from the past had been shattered over and over again. Once, the words of the gods were the truth, but now, he felt everything was quite the opposite. What the gods had said seemed rarely true. He noticed that special group entrenched in the upper ranks of bronze humanity. Every so often, some humans would be imbued with that unique bloodline aura. Cohen initially wanted to stop it, but then he gave up. The abilities stemming from the special substance within his body could influence emotions to some extent, making people filled with hope or desolation. It also allowed him to perceive others' feelings more clearly. To his disappointment, those humans tainted with the special aura were far from virtuous. There was no coercion, only temptation. Cohen had even witnessed someone drinking the black blood out of their own free will. Evans, do you think the path humanity is taking now is the right one? Feeling a bit lost, Cohen asked this to the first bronze human he met on a leisurely afternoon, also a good friend he had made over the past years. He hadn't expected an answer, but surprisingly, Evans responded seriously, "I don't know, Cohen, but if you think it's not right, why not do something about it?" Do something? Yes, I always feel like you're lacking a goal. Despite teaching us how to fight wild beasts here, I bet you wouldn't have come up with that idea if I hadn't seen the power you displayed that day. Chapter 258. In the past, Evans's personality was somewhat unrestrained, but now, his face was stern as he gripped the bronze sword and viciously cleaved downward. With a clanging collision, the bronze sword sank deeply into the boulder, a feat not achievable by ordinary bronze humanity, but one result of the years Evans had spent refining himself. Honestly, I'm not too fond of those priests nowadays. The creator is gone, and everything seems to have undergone a massive change. Yet for me, even if I could split this stone with one sword strike, it wouldn't change anything, but you're different. Turning to gaze into Cohen's eyes, Evans said solemnly, "Your power is enough to shatter hills, sever rivers, and if you wish, you can put an end to the priest's actions that you find dissatisfying. If you're unhappy with the current state of Aurora, you could replace those priests and steer the human tribes in the direction you believe is right. If that is the case, why don't you do it?" After a long silence, under Evans's expectant gaze, Cohen exhaled deeply. "Because I don't know what is right, Evans. But you once told me about the Golden Age. The golden humanity had unwavering faith. They believed that the gods were omniscient, omnipotent, and that they were flawless. This is how they understood the divine and how they expected themselves to be, which resulted in the Golden Age I told you about." Cohen looked at his friend and asked earnestly, "What about you? Can you find an object for your thoughts now, telling yourself, striving in this direction is definitely right?" "I cannot." The image of the goddess of Huthfire flashed through his mind, but Evans truly couldn't convince himself as the goddess no longer responded to humans. "That's why I'm somewhat aimless. I don't know what is right. Just like now, even if I replaced the priests by force, how could I ensure I would make humanity better rather than worse? At least now, everyone can live normally, even if things are somewhat worse than before. Striving in the wrong direction only leads to the wrong outcome. The harder you try, the more incorrect it becomes. That's another reason I feel lost." Shaking his head slightly, Cohen no longer dwelled on such gloomy matters but shifted the conversation. "All right, enough about that. I've recently discovered that letting the energy inside the body oscillate in a specific rhythm can unleash greater power. However, if the rhythm is off, it can harm oneself. I've already tried it. Do you want to give it a go?" "Of course. I too dream of one day battling the wild beasts outside the wilderness." Cohen's change of subject was abrupt, but Evans roughly understood his thoughts. Perhaps having grown accustomed to faith, even though now freed from its shackles, it was hard to regain confidence in their own decisions for a while. In this regard, Evans wasn't much better off than bronze humanity. They followed the guidance of the priests because of their close relationship with the gods and the creator. Even though one had abandoned them and the other had left, humans still instinctively chose to obey. If decades were like this, think of millennia. So the sounds of practice resumed, as if the earlier conversation had been forgotten by both of them. However, at night, when Cohen was lying alone in his bed, he couldn't help but think again about these issues. Lately, he had been lacking direction. Perhaps humans do need a god, but certainly not those entities with thoughts like those of ordinary people. Musing silently, Cohen questioned himself. Faith in the mythic world held power, but even discounting that power, it could still fill people with hope and offer solace. Yet the prerequisite was that the object of this faith, and those guiding people towards it, harbored no ill will. He should be great, perfect, like the world itself. He brings down thunder and do not to express delight or wrath towards mortals, but simply because he wishes to, with no other reason. Muttering to himself, Cohen couldn't help but compare the Olympian gods. Such a god, perhaps, is the true god. Maybe the god worshipped by the golden humanity never existed, as this world may not harbor a being that aligns with human morality yet wields incomprehensible power. Cohen sank into contemplation, and at a certain moment, he felt a thread of faith towards the world itself, which then quickly broke. However, once faith had arisen, it did not dissipate, and since chaos would not accept faith, the power began to divide. Some of it reached the earth, but Mother Earth was still slumbering, unaware of this slight occurrence. Some drifted into the spirit realm, but as Cohen was already a semi-devotee of the spirit realm, this raised no attention. Yet some ventured into places they shouldn't have. At the far reaches of the sky, beyond the touch of mortals, when this faith connected, a vague concept suddenly stirred. This powerful and pure faith, brief as it was, seemed to break an equilibrium, making a colossal entity's finger twitch unconsciously. No one noticed this scene, only Atlas felt momentarily compelled to kneel down under the heavy pressure and then vanished quickly, leaving Atlas to wonder if it was merely an illusion. This is E. Imperceptible voices echoed at the edge of the heavens, then fell silent once more. Cohen's contemplation was brief, and soon, everything returned to normal. As if nothing had happened, only the world itself bore witness to it all. As the integration of the 9 realms elevated the origin of the world once more, the destiny that had seemed set in stone was rewritten yet again. Chapter 259 Different Choices. Another spring had passed. The sky was tinged with the hues of dawn, and a moist, warm breeze blew across the earth. Mornings after rain were always intoxicating, but Pandora, who had just awoken, was not in the least bit uplifted in spirit. Yesterday, she had seen off yet another goddess who had come to flaunt her treasures. This time, the visitor had brought a string of pearls, said to be jewels nurtured by the surviving shellfish of a previous epoch in the depths of the sea. Talia had meticulously recounted the origins of these shellfish. They were born in the Golden Age, absorbing the essence of ocean water and starlight from above, and it took hundreds of years for a single pearl to form. Though not a single mocking word was spoken, the insinuation could not have been clearer. Pandora couldn't understand why there were such tedious deities in the world. But then again, it wasn't certain, for the deities' daily lives were indeed dull. Maybe Talia was just looking for some amusement. What Pandora couldn't accept, however, was that she might very well be that amusement. So what exactly is in here? Seated at the table, Pandora tapped on an urn adorned with mysterious patterns. Now, she lived alone in this place. Epimetheus had disappeared to who knows where. Her daughter Pitha had been taken by her cousin to frolic, and might not return for a few days. Only Pandora was left to stay here alone. The only companionship she had, aside from the plants and flowers, was this urn of unknown use. Humph! All your things are borrowed, but Hades' gift is mine alone. With a cold snort, as if to comfort herself. But though she said this, Pandora had no clue how the urn functioned. It was said to absorb disaster and pain, yet Pandora could not perceive these conceptual presences. She had tried asking Epimetheus, but he too professed ignorance. Thus in her eyes, it was just an ordinary urn, nothing special. As for the additional gift sent by Liana, the ruling deity of the underworld, Pandora was even more puzzled. Nothing is impossible. She desired to become a deity and wanted the tedious Talia to fear her. Since all of this was impossible, could this urn somehow make it happen? Maybe it really could. Pandora pursed her lips, unconsciously stroking her long hair that fell over her shoulders. If there had been no precedent in this world, she might not have entertained such thoughts. But there was indeed one. The goddess of the magic net, Hecate, was said to be a godly being birthed during the age of the second divine king, like Pandora herself. Others claimed she was actually a descendant of a titan. However, the god renowned to be her father, the god of material destruction, had not appeared in the world for a long time. No one knew his whereabouts, and thus it was difficult to verify. At least for now, Pandora preferred to believe that it was a life form similar to her own. Sigh. I mustn't open it. She half extended her hand and then quickly retreated, forcing herself not to look at the urn. This utterly ordinary urn seemed to possess a magic power. Lately, it always stirred her mind. This was particularly true when she was alone at home. Feeling somewhat agitated, Pandora placed the urn on the table and then went out alone to clear her mind. That night, the post-rain air carried the fragrance of petals, and as Pandora lay in bed, her eyes looked somewhat lifeless. Her thoughts roamed freely, imagining various futures. Perhaps it was innate. Her strong desire to discover everything made it unbearable to have such an unknown object right beside her, right before her eyes. This was clearly a gift meant for me. Biting her lip, the outside sky had grown dark. It was another night of stars without the moon. On such nights, a certain inexplicable palpitation arose in Pandora's heart. All was silent. It was as if she were the only person here. Everything had drifted away from her, leaving only the woman lying in bed and the urn that seemed to be gazing back at her. The intertwining patterns on it looked like an eye. For a moment, Pandora even thought the eye blinked. But then she realized it was just an illusion. It was just an ordinary urn, no different from others. If there was anything special about it, it was perhaps that it contained some extraordinary things. But I can't see them. Her breathing quickened, unusually distinct in the silence. In the past, she had wanted to open the urn more than once, but each time she had ultimately stopped herself. She remembered Hades' instructions, but just as Talia had said, the master of the underworld hadn't actually mentioned any consequences of opening it. And even if there were, under the god's blessings, it could not possibly harm Pandora. Murmuring softly, Pandora sat up from bed. It was said that the goddess of the magic net was also born on a starlit but moonless night like this one. Bearing celestial fire, she walked the earth for thousands of years and ultimately ascended to divinity. Perhaps fate was also hinting that this was the perfect opportunity? Just this once. Indeed, just once. Under the hazy starlight, Pandora silently vowed. Chapter 260. There is only one chance. Without the shine of the moon, the earth was steeped in utter darkness, and the stars tonight were not as bright as usual, only faint glimmers appearing now and then. But this was not a matter of just a day or two. In recent years, the stars that were originally the brightest in the zodiacal star domain had dimmed significantly compared to the past. According to the sun god Helios, the heroic spirits and god of stars, who used to travel across the night sky, seemed to be busy with other affairs now. Even when he drove his sun chariot across the sky, he seldom saw their figures. Therefore, the mortals usually stayed behind closed doors at night nowadays, and the deities didn't venture out much either. However, today was an exception for two gods. Hidden behind a layer of clouds floating midair, Epimetheus was watching over the airspace above the garden. Although nothing was visible to the eye, he was certain that there was an invisible current of air there. It was highly likely the god of west wind. Epimetheus had heard of him. He had gained favor with Zeus by offering a divine artifact and, unlike the sun god who had also switched allegiances, received a completely different treatment. It seems that the god who frequently visited here before was him. Indeed, there is no one more suitable than the wind gods. The young man's face bore an innocent smile as he stood alongside the invisible current, peering through the open window at his wife in the room in the distance, struggling and getting lucky, unlike the latter who was oblivious to his presence. Right from the start, Epimetheus had been aware that they might be watched, so despite not being a talker, he had deliberately spoken the warning that Prometheus gave before he left. Then, sure enough, someone gave themselves away a little because of that, and over the following decades, he gradually pinpointed their position. It must be said, the absoluteness of divine authority was indeed difficult to break, and even now, Epimetheus couldn't detect any difference between that current of air and the natural elements. But oftentimes, no anomaly did not equate to being reasonable. Over the years, he had made up excuses to leave the garden not just because he was reluctant to face the graces, but more so to map out the patterns of climate changes nearby. And according to those patterns, there shouldn't be a current of air there now. There is only one chance. This is the best opportunity. With a sharp look in his eyes, at this moment, Epimetheus was no longer the naive younger brother before the forethinker or the foolish afterthinker in the eyes of the deities. He reached out his hand, and an invisible force enveloped the area ahead. He indeed was the afterthinker among the deities, but perhaps his lack of presence was so pronounced that few realized that, just as the god of wisdom could bestow wisdom upon others, the afterthinker could also make others slow to realize. Epimetheus unleashed his power, and his authority that worked on consciousness shrouded the place where the current of air was for a moment. Almost immediately, the backlash of the law struck him, his complexion turning deathly pale, but his smile was bright. His judgment was not wrong. The feedback from the authority told him that there was indeed a life form that had been affected by him. Who? You were right. You clearly could change something, but you just don't want to. That describes me quite well. Wiping away the blood that had spilled from the corner of his mouth with a wave of his hand, Epimetheus recalled an unexpected encounter in a human tribe some time ago. One was the goddess of the nether moon. Not too long ago, he had seen this powerful deity once more on Mount Olympus. But for the other, he had no recollection, his presence leaving no memory in the afterthinker's heart. Such a terrifying ability was probably just as the goddess of the nether moon had said before, the gift from the Lord of the spirit realm. Yet another powerful ancient god. But he was no different from the other deities. Endowed with innate powers, they then demanded from the weak with the attitude of the strong, displaying their arrogance. Is it wrong to be indifferent towards a future that is destined not to change? Epimetheus didn't think so. He simply made the right choice. Meaningless defiance was unnecessary. If there was no opportunity, he would have continued to drift with the current all along. But now, seeing the possibility of change right before his eyes, he would not hesitate to act. Just like how his brother deceived the deities, he had chosen the most foolish and meaningless way, betting his life on insignificant things, only to fail miserably as expected. This was the fate he deserved. In the same regard as an adversary to the deities, his brother remained loyal to a former divine king of whom now nothing was known, only to eternally suffer the punishment of holding up the sky, which was also a fitting recompense for his stupidity. But he was different. Today, he too would deceive the divine king, but that was only for himself, not any other existence. Apart from him and that foolish woman, nobody would know what happened. Hum! A humming sound rang out, and Epimetheus knew that the jar had probably been opened. As if given some command, at this moment, the authority of the gods of the underworld was stirred. Even far beneath the ground, they were still aware that the anchor they had given had left its rightful place. So, in the newly built divine palace within the fields of truth, Hades signaled to his attendants, and the gathered deities quickly took their commands. Chapter 261. The authority of the true gods began to manifest itself, centered around that anchor on the ground, revealing themselves shamelessly in the form of black mists, swarming flies, and various impurities before Pandora and the two silent observers, then suddenly spreading out. They passed through mountains and rivers, crossed fields and walls, and in an instant scattered to every corner of the world. This was an act allowed by the divine king, and from then on, perhaps the gods of the underworld would no longer receive genuine worship from humans, but their existence itself would become an insignificant yet inescapable part of human civilization. From now on, strife, hatred, calamity, lust, and deceit would run rampant in the mortal realm, not a distortion of thought, but a subtle and pervasive influence. And compared to these intangible disasters, plagues and catastrophes would immediately unfold. Consider it a punishment. You betrayed your creator. Prometheus might forgive you, but that does not mean I will. Watching all this happen, Epimetheus no longer hesitated. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He landed on the ground, quietly passing through the garden, and opened the wooden door of the room. In front of him, Pandora, with her back to him, watched in disbelief what was unfolding before her. Black smoke continued to pour out of the jar, announcing its existence to the world. Pandora never imagined this was the so-called gift. All the disasters were released by her, as she valiantly tried to put the lid back on the jar, but it was all in vain. Finally, Pandora, exhausted, sat down on the ground. She watched the various disasters fly out of the jar one by one until, in the end, she saw a glimmer of light. That was the reflection of a star, which, as everything else left, seemed to sense the change in the environment and prepared to leave the jar to merge into the fate of all humans. But at that moment, a hand picked up the lid, and the jar that Pandora could not close with all her strength was thus closed. "You!" Pandora turned around abruptly, speechless at the sight of her husband, who had appeared behind her without her noticing. She first wanted to justify her action but then realized something was amiss. Why was Epimetheus here? How long had he been here? Why had he watched everything happen? And why did he close the last gift back into the jar? "Shoo! Don't be surprised." Putting his forefinger to his lips, the afterthinker signaled his wife to keep her voice down. "I am also a god, though not a particularly mighty one, but it's not strange for me to have such power. But why didn't you close it sooner? I just wanted to see what was inside. I didn't intend to release those things." When she saw the black mist, Pandora already knew what it was. Indeed, the jar could absorb disasters and calamities because it was itself an object designed to confine them. And now she had personally released them. "I know, these are just some disasters. They didn't exist because of what you did, though future generations will probably record it that way. But in reality, you just gave some people a real excuse to bring them down to the mortal realm, making their actions seem a bit more reasonable," Epimetheus casually remarked as he glanced at the brand new jar. "And what about that last one?" Pandora, slowly regaining her composure, looked at her husband, who appeared indifferent, and angrily questioned, "Why did you leave it inside? Who said that? It clearly left as well." Moreover, Epimetheus reached out to take the jar, but in the end he refrained. "Pandora, you don't really consider yourself a member of mankind, do you?" At that moment, he recalled the words of the goddess of the nether moon. This was a gift from the Lord of the spirit realm to mankind. If a deity tried to take it, they would certainly pay a price. Luckily, Epimetheus had no intention of taking it. Since it was a gift from the goddess of the nether moon to Pandora, he decided to let her keep it. "Come, pick it up, we must leave now." Smiling, Epimetheus commanded, "Pandora, you have yet to answer. I want you to pick it up." As Pandora finally felt the increasingly icy gaze of her husband, she realized that he was not only a well-known fool among the gods, but also a true deity. She hesitated, protected as she was by the blessing of the goddess. But in the end, she embraced the jar. "Very good, Pandora, we are family. Do not regard outsiders as more important than us, like my brothers do. Be it humans or the divine king, neither are trustworthy. Their fates serve as a clear warning." With a satisfied nod, the afterthinker glanced outside once more. The observer had departed, and they could now escape the crime. After all, Zeus wouldn't pursue the matter, as long as the unknown deity reported everything to him, informing him that all the gifts within the jar had been released. Then Zeus would act as if they didn't exist, rather than chasing them all over the world. Now, the key to breaking destiny is in my hands. Heh! I thought there would be some kind of turmoil, but I didn't expect everything to go so smoothly. It seems even destiny is on my side, wishing for me to change it. With Pandora in tow, Epimetheus pushed open the door. Their daughter Pytha had not yet returned, but the afterthinker did not care much for her. If not for needing someone to carry the jar, he wouldn't even want to take Pandora with him. Just leave like this, for once he figured out the true purpose of the items hidden within the jar, everything would get better. Today was perfect. The sky remained dim. A quiet night like this seemed to hide all secrets, deep and peaceful. Elsewhere, at the doorway where Epimetheus was preparing to leave, the god of west wind, who had also witnessed the entire process, had long since transformed into an intangible current of air, flying high in the sky. Without waiting any longer, upon seeing everything within the jar released, he immediately departed. As dawn approached, Zephyrus finally returned to Olympus. Heading straight for the palace of Zeus, he had thought that Zeus would still be resting, but to his surprise, Zeus had been waiting for a long time. "Your Majesty, I've come to report back to you." With a respectful bow, Zephyrus began speaking to the divine king seated high above. "As you foresaw, Pandora indeed opened Hades's gift on her own, unleashing calamities upon the mortal realm. Truly, your foresight is unparalleled. I am aware. What else?" Zeus had known about the calamities the moment the jar was opened. After all, as the divine king, he would not fail to notice such events. But what he truly cared about was clearly not the work of his brother. The gift from the goddess of the nether moon. It has also been released. Zephyrus hesitated, then said with certainty, although he felt a bit confused. Nonetheless, the god of west wind faintly recalled seeing a flash of light. It must have been released. There was no mistake in this regard. Zephyrus trusted his judgment. The fact that he was slightly distracted was rather normal. Perhaps it was just the fatigue from focusing too long, as even a god can feel tired. Chapter 262 Vows and Beginnings. Is that so? Well then, you have done well. Although somewhat regretful, Zeus had anticipated this outcome. Or rather, in his view, the mysterious gift from the spirit realm was like Hades' gift, not truly intended for that divine creation, but meant to be released through Pandora's hands. After all, it is said that among the primordial deities, the Lord of the spirit realm and Mother Night held abilities related to fate. Perhaps they foresaw something. As long as it did not interfere with his acquisition of faith, Zeus now had no desire to pay attention to these trivial matters. After all, Mother Earth would not sleep forever, and unlike other primordial gods, she too needed outside forces to compensate for her deficiencies. On top of that, the Titan, Gaia, who he had imprisoned, was his potential enemy. Since that is the case, Zephyrus, go to the southern seas and inform the Sea Emperor. He seems so eager to inflict punishment upon humans. I now permit it. He may do so in any way he sees fit, and I only want the result. Of course, remind him not to be too hasty, to slightly slow down the timing. Since it is a punishment, humans should be given some time to react. It would be best if they could record all of this. When the humans of the next era are born, let them unearth the demise of their predecessors themselves. Let them know that without the protection of the divine king, the sea and the underworld will bring them catastrophe. Raising his right hand, a scepter embedded with 3 gemstones appeared in Zeus' hand. Today, this divine artifact forged by the previous divine king, though still of questionable power, has acquired some special abilities after being passed down through 2 reigns. With a gesture of the scepter, an invisible force coalesced into a token, the symbol of the divine king's permission for Poseidon to exercise authority on the land. Even if he didn't allow it, Zeus was actually powerless to stop a deity with mighty divine power from exercising their authority. However, many things work this way. Adding an extra procedure can better display the legitimacy of the divine court. And for these minor matters, the deities are willing to give the divine king face. As you command, your majesty, your orders shall be executed. After receiving the token and bowing, the god of the west wind left the great hall and hurried away from Mount Olympus. He had been very busy lately, but thinking about all this being for the coming of the next human era, and that he would soon have his own human followers, filled Zephyrus with motivation. As a deity presiding over a part of meteorology, he believed he would not lack followers in the future. Perhaps one day he, a true god with only weak divine power, could step by step gaze upon the throne of a mighty principal god. Watching the retreating figure of Zephyrus, Zeus sat quietly in the palace for a while. His gaze, passing through the doorway, now saw the changing laws clearly on the land. Outside Mount Olympus, the great magic net that connected the spirit realm with the present world covered the heavens and the earth. The elemental forces slowly flowed along the strings of the magic net. From beneath the earth, streams of black mist rose, merging with everything in the mortal plane. The breath of the mortal realm was no longer as pleasant, but it paradoxically gained some vitality. Looking at this scene, Zeus vaguely grasped some insight, but ultimately gained nothing. This is the nature of primordial gods. Their inherent station allows them to see things that mortals can only dream of, yet their lack of understanding of their own power prevents them from turning any insight into tangible progress. Because their foundation is hollow, strength gained by instinct and experience may work, but to some extent, it becomes a shackle preventing them from progressing further. It seems that henceforth, plagues will accompany great floods. The divine authority over mundane things is still too great. It's manageable now, but in the next human century, we can't allow them such unrestrained actions. Musing in silence on unrestrained actions, Zeus indeed thought this way, although all this sprung from his open or hidden suggestions. Just because the divine king could act this way did not mean others could as well. Moreover, Zeus didn't believe that, in the future, the gods would completely comply with a normal way of competing for faith. They might do anything, and as the divine king, his job was to forestall such behavior. Conflicts between gods must not carelessly impact humans, at least not so that a conflict between two deities directly targets the other's followers. Otherwise, it would not only harm the image of the gods, but slaughter would also come too easily, and it would take centuries for humanity to recover, which is the wealth of the gods. Especially as the king of all gods, the god who grants humans the right to live, Zeus, like the earth, the sun, is an indispensable part of humans, and he too could gain a little bit of faith from all humans. While not much and far less than the faith given by direct worship, it is still something. It seems I need to establish a rule afterward, that the gods should not arbitrarily exercise their divine authority, for fragile humans cannot withstand such. I wonder when Themis will return. Although the bronze humanity had not yet perished, Zeus had already considered much. As the divine king, as the greatest beneficiary of the rules, he should spare no effort to maintain them. So he needed to establish a law preventing the gods from destroying humans unreasonably, unless they had directly offended a deity. And to do this, he still needed the assistance of his aunt. Chapter 263. Just in time, the goddess of law seems to be busy with something recently, and by the time she returns, humans will probably be extinct. In the context of corpses scattered across the earth, presenting such a suggestion would undoubtedly gain support. On this day, aside from the divine king on Mount Olympus, many others noticed the change. When Pandora opened the jar, the gods of the underworld were permitted, and they began to use their inherent divine authority to affect the mortal world. Even without involving transcendent powers, these natural shifts were sufficient to bring about catastrophe for humanity. But on this tranquil evening, all mortals were still unaware of what had happened. Disease had begun to spread, and the outline of calamities started to ferment, yet it would be a long time before their eruption. In the deep night, everything appeared silent and still, with only a very few beings in the human-occupied regions able to detect these subtle changes on the level of the law. Standing at the core of Aurora, Mephisto looked apprehensively at the burning sacred fire. Having once been human, he thought he could approach this flame, even draw some from it like other humans, but that was not the case. As he tried to draw near, a sense of crisis from deep within his soul made Mephisto involuntarily stop in his tracks. He was certain that if he moved forward, the sacred fire was likely to burn from reality towards his own spirit, turning him into ashes inside and out. After the fruitless attempt, the devil had no choice but to find a place far from the sacred fire, to use its aura to mask his presence, and then somewhat indulgently admired this rare grand view. Everything was as he had anticipated. Prometheus doomed himself, humanity was about to face retribution, and hundreds of mortal elites had consumed his blood, preparing the events he had long arranged. They sketched runes, carved stone scriptures, and built altars with materials brought by the devil. Mortals would not understand what they were doing, but only Mephisto knew. This was a special ritual that would serve its purpose at the right time. With this ritual, after this operation was over, he would likely face the wrath of gods from the spirit realm as well as those from Mount Olympus, for, according to the Lord of the Nine Hells, this ritual could very well touch some rather sensitive divine nerves. It doesn't matter. Someone will take care of them for me? Mephisto chuckled, thinking of the news he had secretly let slip and that naive god of sleep. The former would be enough to give Olympus something to deal with, making them too preoccupied to intervene. The latter was waiting for him to lure away the gods of the spirit realm so he could achieve his patricide. But Mephisto was equally looking forward to some activity from him on that day, so the gods of the spirit realm wouldn't keep chasing after him. If that god named Hypnos truly succeeded, it would be a win-win deal. But for the devil who knew the truth, he only hoped to finish his tasks early on that day and find time to see how that fellow would die. "And you? What will you do then?" Mephisto murmured, looking toward the east of the city, feeling the presence that was hard to ignore. Cohen, the human, was the only unplanned factor in his scheme. He appeared without any warning, as if a human had just emerged out of nowhere, and it was unknown how he possessed that power. However, thankfully, through years of probing, the devil had gradually discovered that Cohen seemed to be grappling with some puzzling issue, which reduced his desire to interfere with the outside world. Although he didn't know what Cohen was thinking, such a state, the longer it lasted, the better. Let it be, it's best to keep it up indefinitely. The unknown is truly bothersome, and that guy I met by accident, I don't know what that strange puppet is, but fortunately, its power is weak, and it can't affect much. I'll just avoid it, he resolved. Being 90 miles into a 100-mile journey, the Chaos world did not have this proverb, but Mephisto still seriously recalled all the past events one by one until he was sure there were no issues before he could relax. After completing this operation, he could return to the Nine Hells for a visit and claim part of the rewards due to him. At least in terms of being a boss, the Lord of the Nine Hells was quite trustworthy. In the spirit realm on Mount Sinai, in the mortal world's opposite side, in the spirit realm that almost covered most places of the entire world, Lane sat in the main seat of the Temple of Lops. The seasons outside had not changed many times, but in this distorted space-time, a long time had already passed. At some point, the remaining shaft of Gungnir in Lane's hands had been split again, becoming 3 sections, 2 short and 1 long. The shorter 2 sections contained opposing powers, but they shared the remainder of the divine artifacts, Gungnir, Name, and Fate. They had lost their vitality because the little remaining power had concentrated into the middle section, which also exclusively possessed the power of the Oath, remaining in the divine artifact. Chaos's Oath originally belonged to the world, but during the Second Era, it was bestowed upon the Styx River, and thus Styx came into existence. As long as gods swore oaths to the river in the world, they would slightly enhance Styx's power, and if a god broke the oath after enacting the punishment, the goddess's power would significantly increase. Chapter 264. By comparison, although Lane could also make people swear oaths to the spirit realm, this didn't actually involve the true authority of the oath but was merely an alternative application of the world's power. However, at present, this divine artifact from beyond the realm clearly wasn't subject to this limitation. The power within this short wooden rod was exceptionally pure, and after being transformed by the spirit realm, only the part that belonged to the oath remained. The rest had been rejected and fallen to the 2 sections before and after this piece. But this power, besides being pure, was also extremely weak, because any oath required a force to oversee its execution, and now it obviously lacked that power. Originally, Gungnir could respond to the wishes of each person who swore to it, because the existence of the world tree Yggdrasil provided the necessary support. The divine tree, which upheld the 9 realms, possessed unimaginable might. It was like Chaos's Tartarus, which, although lacking a clear consciousness, allowing successive divine kings to use it as a prison, no one could question its strength. As a divine artifact forged from the branches of the world tree, Gungnir maintained a connection with its mother, and this connection was the fundamental guarantee that the oath would be fulfilled. But now, there was no world tree in this world, and the little life force it had left was insufficient to recreate a world tree capable of sustaining the world. Relying only on its insignificant power, Gungnir could probably only bind ordinary things, and might not even be effective against more powerful entities. Not bad. Many things just need to be suitable. With a satisfied smile, Lane picked up the 3 broken sections of the spear shaft. He lightly tossed the other 2 sections, with their differing colors, out of the palace, and they fell onto Mount Sinai. Passing through the triple time-space barriers, these two sections of the spear ultimately descended into a giant stone well located at the center of a realm. Without splashing or floating on the water's surface, they silently sank to the bottom. Not even a ripple stirred. That's about right. Keeping the slightly greenish section of the rod in hand, Lane turned his gaze to the huge dragon egg that was now showing some cracks, and to the reflection of that star from the mortal world. She was going to be born today, on this very day when the world's spiritual power was at its peak, and coincidentally, it was also the day that Pandora's magic jar was opened. Perhaps humans in the future would attach some dreadful monikers to this day. After all, it marked the beginning of the end for a generation. But this all had little to do with Lane, so he waited for Bai's birth while watching the drama unfold. The wind god's bewilderment, the afterthinker's resolve, and his claim that he had grasped the key to breaking fate, yet without even touching the jar itself. It was the same trick he had played on Zephyrus, the god of the west wind. The god of hindsight couldn't be certain that the creator of the gift had sensed it, and indeed it was an unknown. Although Mother Earth could not sense what unfolded around the golden apple, and deity might not be able to monitor every action of the life they blessed, Epimetheus maintained the proper caution for a gift from an unfamiliar ancient. So, just as he had deliberately spoken Prometheus's warnings to him to expose the wind god's weakness, what he said in front of the clay jar was also a kind of test. If the person behind this was watching him, perhaps they would act against him for his offensive words. This might seem like asking for trouble, but it was better to be approached by someone now than to be unknowingly watched and targeted at a crucial moment. Regrettably, Lane was not the wind god, and he didn't care who ultimately received this gift or what Epimetheus said. Since the other party had followed the rules he had set, leaving the gift in human hands, they might as well keep it. In fact, if the god of hindsight could indeed accomplish something with this gift that surprised Lane himself, he would only be pleased. However, the likelihood of that was probably not very high. Zeus and his brothers made different choices, and you three brothers have done the same, an astonishing resemblance. The one who chose humanity was betrayed by humans, but the future remains unknown. The one who chose the king has never been forgotten by his king, it's just not the right time yet. Recalling his occasional interactions with the former divine king, Lane reflected again. The others' moral standards were indeed quite high among the male deities who possessed power and held authority. They ultimately did nothing to their betraying wife, and even in the abyss, they did not forget their loyal followers. However, compared to your brothers, the one who chose himself truly has to rely on himself alone. There is no distinction of better or worse. If Epimetheus has sufficient capability, then choosing oneself might not be a wrong choice. Lane refrained from any judgment until the final outcome was revealed. Crack. The sudden sound of cracking drew Lane's attention instantly. He looked towards the massive dragon egg in front of him, from which the sound originated. A crack appeared at the very top of the eggshell, and then the noise stopped. However, Lane was not in the least bit anxious. He knew that the little one inside was probably gathering strength. Boom! Crack! A thumping sound accompanied by another cracking noise. The fissure grew wider. But this time, the young dragon didn't stop. It kept battering the eggshell continuously. Crack, 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 crack. Little by little, fine lines began to spread over the surface of the dragon egg, until at one moment, under Lane's expectant gaze, with a final crisp sound, the top of the eggshell finally broke open a small hole. The hole was small, not even as big as a baby's palm, but its very appearance signified that there was no longer a barrier between the dragon egg and the outside world. Then, in the next instant, an ethereal shadow emerged from it. It seemed much larger than the hole, yet it appeared as if the size made no difference at all. This was a white dragon, slim in form, with resplendent wings and delicate, smooth, lustrous scales. She didn't resemble a newborn dragon, but rather a miniature version of a young dragon. As a dragon brought to life by spirituality, she was naturally touched by this power. Her appearance was influenced by her self-awareness, which in turn was influenced by the forces of the spirit realm. Thus, although her image was innate, it carried all the impressions of beauty, in a dragon that the Lord of the Spirit Realm had in his past memories, which made her look nothing like the ugliness often associated with the just-born. In the center of the temple, the young dragon opened her silver eyes and took in her surroundings. The temple, the shattered eggshell, and the black-clothed figure she felt close to. That was all there was to her birthplace. She opened her mouth and inhaled. The broken eggshell transitioned from substance to void, consumed in a form of energy. The young dragon then fluttered her wings lightly, landing on Lane's arm. "It seems you're in good shape," Lane said with a slight smile, extending his hand to tenderly stroke the young dragon's head. The scales were not rough to the touch but rather had a soft and warm feel. He knew that, as the origin of the spirit dragon race, Bai could indeed glimpse fate and control the elements, but the psychic realm was where she truly excelled. Her body could thus shift between the tangible and intangible at will, soft and pliable under his touch but an indestructible guard in the face of an enemy. "Are you my creator?" she asked. Without speaking, a gentle voice entwined with unfamiliarity toward the world entered Lane's mind. Faced with the young dragon's question, Lane simply shook his head. "Creator is a bit of a stretch. I only provided the most suitable environment for your birth, but now you have no connection with your original creator. So from now on, the spirit realm will be your home." Bai shook her little head, as if to indicate she understood. But then, the newly born creature's attention was caught by something else. Those were the other dozen or so dragon eggs lying on the ground, still separated from the external environment by Lane's power, which is why they hadn't undergone any unique changes. "They are your kin, but they will not be like you," Lane said, observing the confusion in Bai's eyes. "How about this? What kind of dragon they will become can be decided by you. What do you think?" Lane proposed with a smile. Not quite understanding Lane's meaning, Bai nonetheless nodded her head. The instincts from her bloodline naturally made her see those weaker than herself as subordinates. Making decisions for one's subordinates was the most natural thing to do. Chapter 265 Disaster. That may be so. Bai just born obviously couldn't grasp the nuances just yet. What Lane wanted her to decide on was actually the force that brought these dragons into being. But she clearly misunderstood. She thought she was to decide their appearance, which is what kind of dragon meant to her. So she began to look around, observing the decorations in the great hall. The towering columns were engraved with ancient patterns, creations from the previous era exuding a breath of ages. If she were a time dragon, she might have appreciated such things, but as the supreme being of the spirit realm, Bai merely glanced over them before moving on. Then there were the tables and chairs, stone carvings, incense, decorative pieces, or the cups and bright lamps. These items were aesthetically pleasing, but undoubtedly required a life form with enough experience to appreciate the skill and art they contained. As a newly born dragon, Bai's taste was evidently still basic and crude, so she glossed over these unimpressive things once again. Ultimately, perhaps due to an inherent nature within her bloodline, Bai's gaze lingered significantly when it swept over a relief on the wall. There, a variety of gleaming gemstones sparkled brilliantly, with pure elemental power radiating from them. A perfect match in power and aesthetics captivated Bai instantly. "I want this," Bai said, her expression seemingly formal as she pointed with her right wing at the diverse array of gemstones. After a moment of silence, and facing the young dragon's silver eyes, Lane realized his mistake. It appeared that she hadn't understood his intentions at all. However, glancing at the decorative gemstones, he nodded anyway. These gemstones were after all creations condensed from elemental power, so if Bai chose them, then let her choice represent the elements they symbolized. With a bit of spirituality added, that would be sufficient. With a wave of his hand, the gemstones fell from the wall. There were many, but they roughly categorized into 5 types: amethyst, sapphire, crystal, yellow jade, and jade, each surrounded by a different elemental aura, some pure and some mixed. They fell into the midst of the dragon eggs, each finding a place to merge. The next moment, the force that had isolated the dragon eggs from the outside world dissipated, and they began to adapt to the environment, undergoing various changes. In the void around them, a mix of elemental power and a touch of spirituality began to flow into the eggs. The gemstones previously chosen served as guides, sorting the elements into their respective categories. However, unlike the two previous dragon eggs, these more ordinary dragon types did not possess the natural ability to be born, nor did their essence support such an act, as these dragons were closer to material life forms and not intimately connected with time and mind like the other two transcendent dragon types. Thus, the force of life was also infused, influencing the direction of changes. They would reproduce and thrive in the normal way, so each type of dragon was not limited to a single individual. Influenced by external forces, they divided into sexes, the numbers varying. Of course, just as Bai was to some extent influenced by the spirit realm, these members of the dragon race would also undergo certain changes. Their temperaments might shift, and it would be difficult to define them by mundane standards of good or evil. Oh, and there's this. Lane remembered something suddenly and, with a gesture, drew over the texts and memories of the spirit realm, blending them with the essence of spirituality into the dragon eggs. A name is an important part of what constitutes an existence of a living being. Originally, all dragons had an innate name that came from deep within their bloodlines, from the black dragon Nidhogg, who had created them. Through this, the black dragon could deepen his connection with his offspring, and in return, his descendants could access the knowledge left in the bloodline by their ancestors, allowing the dragon race to better survive and thrive in the new world. But those transformed by the spirit realm had clearly lost this ability, and Lane had no intention of allowing them to inherit what the black dragon had intentionally left in their bloodlines. Since they lacked an inherent name, he simply decided to give them each an extra one. All right, since you've chosen their forms, you'll be responsible for watching over their birth, Lane concluded as he retracted his right hand. Unlike Bai, who could be nurtured more quickly with the power of time, the time dragon must genuinely experience sufficient time, so there was no need to wait. Seeing Bai looking somewhat expectant, Lane gave one final reminder. But remember to choose an official name for yourself as well. That's a very important matter, he said. Okay, Bai responded nonchalantly, shaking her head as the young dragon flew into the midst of the group of eggs. She hovered above the tallest one, as if they were all clustering around her. The sun of the outer world rose, while the moon of the spirit realm remained unchanging. However, a mysterious atmosphere gradually spread. It seemed that ever since the day of the era's shift, the world had never been quite peaceful. On the ground, the morning sun was just rising. "Lord Andy, please come in." A middle-aged man with tired features welcomed Andy into his home in Giantwood Town. Years had passed since the creator had departed, and the powerful among humans had gradually begun to break free from the old rules and order. Chapter 266. Some among them were no longer satisfied with the past and sought to differentiate ranks in various ways, just like the courtyard before their eyes. Unlike the small yard Andy once lived in, this spacious courtyard was filled with decorations, plants, and some unnameable things. It seemed somewhat contrived. Andy felt that even the simple cups and pots in Lane's small yard had more charm. There was no helping it. Owing to the low artistic level of the Bronze Age, these items could scarcely exhibit any aesthetic appeal, but as a means of distinguishing from the dwellings of ordinary people, the effect was indeed striking. If it weren't for the impending cataclysm, perhaps in a few decades, humans might have developed primitive small manners. But now there seemed no chance for that. "Let's hear it then," Andy said in a solemn voice. "Why rush to summon me here? What's the matter?" The wilderness these days was far from peaceful, with only a few days' journey separating the two locations. But the road was fraught with fierce wild animals. However, Andy, who had hastened here, appeared more composed than the host himself, seemingly unbothered by fatigue. Although the decades hadn't changed Andy's appearance, his temperament had become vastly different. "It has been a trying journey, Lord Andy," the middle-aged man began with some caution. "I've heard that you possess certain extraordinary abilities. If you're referring to those little tricks that assist dramatic performances, then indeed," Andy replied, nodding. He didn't hide it. In fact, there wasn't much to hide. He indeed had learned a special skill called meditation, but that was as far as it went. Simply increasing his spiritual power didn't show any distinct traits, and as for that special carving, he still lacked the qualifications to use it. As for the so-called little tricks, they involved using one's spiritual power to manipulate the strings of the ever-present magic net, granting abilities such as controlling fire and water, and healing minor wounds. Even without much magic power, this didn't hinder the control of elements with one's spirit. Were he to live another 100 years, perhaps Andy could have derived something from these abilities and created rudimentary spells himself. But for now, they weren't as damaging as the brute force impact of his spiritual power on others. This was why these abilities had drawn little attention before. After all, An's methods, resembling performances, hardly seemed like a path to transcendence. Furthermore, there was no concept of a transcendent path among humans of the time. "I'll be blunt, Lord Andy. We need your help," the middle-aged man said with a serious expression as he sighed. "For reasons unknown, recently in Giantwood Town, many people have suddenly become weak, lost their appetites, and started coughing and wheezing. At first, everyone paid it no mind, attributing it to fatigue. Life has been getting tougher for everyone in recent years." Andy merely nodded, offering no reaction. While he remained kind at heart, Andy had come to take the words of the priests with a grain of skepticism. Perhaps the lives of the common folk were harder without the gifts of the divine, but this certainly didn't apply to the man before him. If that were all, it wouldn't be much of an issue. They were just weak and nothing more severe had happened yet. The middle-aged man continued in front of Andy. "But we soon discovered that these symptoms can spread. At first it was just a few people, then dozens, then hundreds. We can't see a pattern to the spread. It seems anyone living in this town could be struck by it. So, you don't know how to solve it, and even you have caught this unknown thing. That's why you thought of me?" Andy asked, his brow furrowed. "But why would you think I can solve this problem?" "What? I've caught this thing, too?" However, as soon as Andy finished speaking, the middle-aged man was taken aback. Aside from feeling tired, he had no other sensations. "If this thing you speak of is the same as what I see, then you probably have caught it. It just hasn't taken effect yet. Like the toxins of some wild animals, maybe it lies dormant for a longer period," Andy said, detecting the man's abnormality with his spiritual sense. The man's breath and body exuded a substance that seemed unhealthy. "Sigh. Lord Andy, I didn't hold out much hope, but now that you can see the presence of these things, that's already a promising start," the middle-aged man said, taking a deep breath and managing a strained smile. "Then let's go. Take me to the others," Andy commanded, his voice serious, although he didn't know what this substance was. If he surrounded himself in the wind element from the magic net with his spiritual power, he could keep it at bay. So he wasn't too worried about this unknown substance. However, others obviously could not do the same, so he needed to understand more deeply the patterns of spread and the origin of this substance. Although those humans contaminated with the substance weren't in mortal danger now, that did not mean they wouldn't be later. In the past, Andy had seen a human invaded by a chronic toxin, who after wailing in agony for a week, died in pain. The experience had shocked him profoundly at the time. Chapter 267. Air. This substance can be transmitted through the air. Not only that, but it can also cling to food and water sources. After visiting 3 places in succession, Andy gradually discovered the commonality of this special existence. They seemed to exist in different varieties, but no matter which type, they were invisible to the naked eye. Even his spirit could only see their presence, without being able to understand their characteristics more deeply. Andy didn't know if this was because his spiritual level was not high enough, having not reached the transcendent realm described in the information of the wood carvings, or if these things were simply beyond understanding, but now he couldn't eradicate them from the root. All I can say is that it seems to be afraid of fire, perhaps because of the power of the sacred fire. If you cook food and water with fire, these things will be destroyed. But beyond that, I have no way to deal with them. Shaking his head slightly, Andy finally suggested, Try to keep those infected with the disease separate from others. If the distance is far enough, the spread should no longer be effective. What about us who are already infected? His expression changed again, but the middle-aged man who had followed Andy for half a day still tried to maintain composure. You priests claim to be entrusted by the Creator to guard and control the power of the sacred fire, don't you? Since this unknown substance fears flames, perhaps the sacred fire can solve this problem. After some thought, Andy finally gave a somewhat viable answer. However, upon hearing this, the middle-aged man's face didn't look good at all. Others might not know, but he was well aware that any human could invoke the sacred fire, but nobody could truly control its power. The so-called guarding and using by the priests was just another form of deceit. Thank you for your advice, Lord Andy, but I would ask that you keep today's events to yourself. After a brief silence, the middle-aged man thanked him in the end. He had invited Andy without much hope, and the result was already satisfying to him. Only why Andy could see this substance did pique his interest. Before, he hadn't taken An's unique abilities seriously, but now he realized he might have underestimated them. No matter, I just hope the trouble can be resolved quickly. He sighed. Since no one had died from it so far, Andy, who had never seen a plague before, didn't think it was such a big disaster. After greeting everyone, he turned and left. After all, he was not knowledgeable in herbs. They had invited him to try their luck, and his shallow transcendent power was not enough to make a difference. As a child, Andy had learned much of mortal knowledge, learned a lot of old history, but had only learned meditation from Lane, the only thing related to transcendence. Although it was the foundation of everything, there clearly wasn't enough time now for him to develop it. Clutching the puppet left by Lane, an intuition suddenly surged in An's heart. Maybe I should learn something else. Ever since the Creator left, the world had become increasingly unstable. In the short term, he wouldn't be able to reach the transcendent, legendary realm mentioned in the wood carving, so perhaps he should also learn some swordsmanship as a protective skill. Disaster spread in the mortal realm, and as it interwove with the integration into human society, strands of the power of faith were born, ultimately falling upon their source. Compared to the offerings of true believers or the civilization slate as the source of human knowledge and civilization, the faith arising from disaster was undoubtedly insignificant. Its only advantage was that as long as there were more intelligent beings on Earth, it would steadily increase without the volatility of mortal devotion. However, the disasters in the mortal realm actually had two sources. One was the gods of the underworld, symbolizing the objectively existing calamities, as they had always existed, just taking this opportunity to come to the mortal realm. The other was the initiator of everything, the woman who had personally opened the magic jar. She represented the man-made calamities, the disasters triggered by humans themselves. At this moment, Pandora, who was walking with Epimetheus on the lands of the West, noticed this strange force that disregarded distance and traveled across half the continent to her surroundings. What is this? It was as if she heard the whisper of creatures, the pain in illness, the fear faced in adversity. Surrounded by these false illusions, Pandora unconsciously shrank, hugging the magic jar tightly in her arms. Alongside her, the god of hindsight glanced at her, revealing an expression of understanding. He knew this scene would inevitably happen, but he didn't expect it so soon. That is faith. Deities can become stronger because of it, but I advise you not to touch it casually, or I cannot assure you of the consequences. Why? Looking around at the encircling influences, Pandora wondered, was it through these terrible things that gods grew stronger? Recalling the grand hall where she was born and the majestic divine king, she couldn't help feeling a strong sense of contrast, just like the different senses she had received from her husband one after another. Because your essence ultimately is not that of a deity, and that is unchangeable. Pandora, as the first woman in the world, your body before birth was just an ordinary stone, made exceptional only because it carried the divine objects brought by my Father God. While this endowed you with a faint divine nature from birth, it does not enable you to absorb faith. Chapter 268. As an assistant in the creation of humans, Epimetheus' understanding of faith had become profoundly deep. Indeed, this power could swiftly help deities amass divine power, and even break the ceiling of godhood if the flow of faith was constant. However, the prerequisite was that you had to possess godhood. At the very least, you had to be a quasi-god like a territorial god, possessing a territory similar to godhood. Without such a medium, directly absorbing the power of faith would be akin to courting death. It would be like touching the origin of godhood itself. Going mad would already be the best outcome. Of course, ordinary beings are also unable to perceive faith, only those who are naturally divine or who have gathered it on their own. The latter does not exist in this world yet, and the former are all descendants of quasi-gods or gods. An existence like Pandora is actually extremely rare. But what about this clay jar? Isn't it said that the things inside can change the impossible? Surrounded by a tumult of faith that was considerable to her, Pandora felt somewhat suffocated. Yet looking at the delicate jar in her hands, covered in patterns, she couldn't help but rise with some hope. I don't know, or rather, I am more inclined to think that it is an object related to fate. It can lead you to find a way out unintentionally, not an all-powerful wishing machine, Epimetheus said, making a judgment and looking at his wife. But I'm also unsure. Why don't you try and wish for a way to make use of these faiths? With regard to the magic jar, the god of hindsight also did not know what it would take to use it. Since Pandora wanted to try, he thought he might as well let her. All right. Biting her lip, if she could not feel faith, Pandora would not be affected. If like a true deity, she could wield godhood to use them, she would rejoice at the presence of faith. But her current situation made it very hard for her to accept. Thus, Pandora silently closed her eyes and prayed in her heart, hoping the clay jar would help fulfill her wish. However, as time passed, under the expectant gaze of the afterthinker, nothing happened. It seems that wishing didn't do anything, even though you are human, the rightful user of it, said Epimetheus a little disappointingly, admitting Pandora's human status. But upon reflection, the god of hindsight was not surprised by such an outcome. After all, it was a relic of fate, and it's quite normal for it to be hard to use. Let's go. Your faith is something I cannot take away. If it's really unmanageable, just leave it as it is. As long as you don't actively engage with it, there really won't be any negative consequences. I understand, she nodded. The woman who brought calamity to humans did not have any solutions and could only try to ignore those false illusions as she continued endlessly following behind Epimetheus. As the two of them slowly vanished into the distance, her earlier wish seemed like a joke. Yet, unbeknownst to her, at the very moment Pandora made her wish, the trajectory of destiny was indeed nudged. But that trajectory remained unknown to all. Even in the profound depths, a disaster of equal magnitude was once again imposed upon Pandora. This is destiny, the prophecy that the divine king did not wish to foresee for himself, because when you observe it, it also observes you. The giver of the gift does not wish to use it himself, for the amount you ask of it is inevitably the amount you must pay. But just as 2 generations of divine kings foundered before destiny, to it, everything is indeed without impossibles. Chapter 269 The Saint is Coming. Spring gradually faded away, and the sun hung high in the sky. In a blink, another 3 months had passed. However, this year's human tribes were markedly different from those of previous years. Disease spread, and the climate had become increasingly unpredictable. Although it was the height of summer, nights were often abnormally cold. People could only huddle by the hearth, drawing some warmth from the flames. Under such circumstances, more people fell ill in their beds. At the same time, some rumors also began to spread among the crowds. On certain cold nights, some claimed to have seen the faces of departed friends on the deserted streets. They had died at the mouths of wild beasts or from the torment of sickness. But now, they wandered the towns at night as if alive. But unlike when they were alive, these supposed dead appeared ethereal, their expressions blank, and before familiar people could approach, they would often vanish in an instant. At first, people thought these were hallucinations, but later many saw the same sights. People started to recall what the Creator had once said. He created the bodies of mortals, but their souls came from a place called the spirit realm. Once they died, their souls would return there. Now, these ghostly figures undoubtedly fit the description of souls. Even the world after death was undergoing such strange changes, bringing yet more gloom to the afflicted human tribes. But all suffering was that of mortals. The gods did not empathize. Even in lofty Olympus, the heavenly empress had recently held a banquet in honor of Aphrodite, the most beautiful of goddesses. Of course, as for being the most beautiful, the heavenly empress herself had never admitted this. The divine king, along with Eurynomy's daughters, the Graces, were valued by the goddess of beauty because of their complementary godhood. Aphrodite requested the divine king, deciding to make them her subgods. Aglaea and Euphrosyne agreed readily. Deities with such modest godhood did not resist becoming subgods to more powerful ones. Moreover, Aphrodite's way of doing things was to their liking. Only the youngest sister, Thalia, expressed refusal. She hoped to stay at the side of the heavenly empress, managing some daily trifles for Hera. Though somewhat surprised, considering the offspring that was soon to be born, the heavenly empress agreed to Thalia's request. Thus, the gods celebrated. They sent gifts, hoping to garner a smile from the goddess. Even Poseidon, lord of the sea, who had also come, did not hesitate to lavish attentions on the goddess of beauty, ignoring the disapproving looks of Amphitrite, the sea empress, and boastfully revealed his intentions. He had commanded his eldest son with the sea empress, the demigod Triton, to wield his trident. On Poseidon's command, Triton would raise waves to bring death to humans. The struggle of mortal things, their final prayers or hatred towards the gods before dying. This was the gift he brought to the goddess of beauty. Aphrodite was not very interested, but many other deities were quite intrigued. Thus, she did not stint in repaying the sea emperor with a charming smile. Witnessing this smile, Poseidon was moved. Even the divine king was momentarily distracted, and many male gods felt envy. They nearly overlooked the difference in power and status between them, and only Hera seethed secretly. Although the banquet was for Aphrodite, it was only because of Hera's duties. As a goddess, she had no fondness for Aphrodite's behavior. She should be restrained. With an unchanged expression, Hera glanced at the divine king, who pretended as if nothing were amiss. Marriage is the best solution. I am considering this for the sake of all gods. If she continues like this, it will only lead to discord among the deities of Olympus. That was the thought, but looking around, it seemed there was no god present worthy of marrying a powerful goddess born from the blood of Uranus. So Hera had no choice but to suppress her emotions temporarily, showing a decorous smile. The gifts having been presented, the banquet continued. However, soon after, one of the deities stood up. The gods around glanced at him, then knowingly turned their attention away. That was the god of the sun, who drove the golden chariot. Dawn was approaching the mortal world. Other gods cared little for the passage of time, but he could not stay, as he had his own duties to fulfill. Helios. Just then, the divine king at the high table suddenly called out to him, "Your Majesty, may I inquire as to your command?" Pausing, Helios bowed slightly and asked softly, "A small matter, my friend. The time is about right. Poseidon's feast is about to unfold, and we should also consider the aftermath." With a smile, Zeus, under the gaze of the gods, produced a golden decree. "When your chariot passes Aurora, hand this to them. It will tell mortals why they have lost the blessings of the gods and why disaster has come upon them. It is not due to themselves, but because of the presumption of Prometheus and the madness of the afterthinker." "I understand." Taking the decree, Helios turned and left. Blaming the sin on the two deities seemed like an attempt to absolve them, but the gods did not care much. Whether those priests were guilty or not, they were about to die anyway, so there was no need to keep sin upon the deceased. In contrast, the two creator gods were still alive. Chapter 270. Humans of the next epoch will understand history thus. Because of two gods who created humanity, humans were born, and then they moved desperately towards extinction. This is the true history. The mortal realm. The air was thick with panic and sorrow among the crowd as, starting 2 months prior, mortals contaminated with disease began to die off one after another. This calamity, different from natural disasters and wild beasts, sparked greater fear among humans, for the unseen was far more unnerving than the seen. Fear stemmed from the unknown, and to calm people's hearts, the priests had to conduct 3 grand rituals to the gods in succession to provide a reasonable explanation for the disaster. They didn't expect any response. Ever since the Creator departed, communication between humans and gods seemed to have been severed. They intended only to appease the populace in the name of the gods, and then to pray for a swift end to this terrible plague. Today was the 3rd ritual. In the center of Aurora City, the high priest Mammon stood outside the grand temple, silently observing. The ceremony had already begun, but he did not go to preside over it himself, instead choosing a junior who had never drunk of the demon's blood and still held some reverence for the deity. His reasons were sound. After all, he was old, and the day would come when he would need to be replaced by a younger generation, so people easily accepted his explanation. The sun was high in the sky, and the ritual was drawing to a close, with the guards maintaining order beginning to relax. They all thought that, like the previous 2 times, the chief celebrant of the ritual would soon emerge from the temple and speak words to soothe the hearts of the people. However, the outcome defied everyone's expectations. Whoosh! Refined animal fat was poured onto the stone altar, and vibrant flames blazed before the temple. Just at that moment, a beam of golden light descended from the sky, directly entering the temple. The top of the temple was breached, but at that moment no one cared. In an instant, the place fell silent, and then quickly erupted into chaos. What is that? Has a god arrived? That golden light is from above the sun. The priests did not lie to us. The gods truly have responded. Is the disaster about to end? In the past, many had doubted the priests' ability to communicate with the gods after the Creator left, but now all their skepticism dissipated. The deity had responded. Perhaps the end of the catastrophe was near. High priest, don't rush. Different from the onlookers, those who gathered around Mammon became somewhat panicked at the sight. They thought this was another punishment for their actions, but Mammon was not among them. He halted the calls of those beside him, and he had, in fact, expected this scene. Mortals were beneath godly notice. The outcome of the previous 2 sacrifices made that clear. They simply did not want to bother with humans. A mysterious individual had told him that before the gods destroyed them, they would twist history, and the most true history was that which humans recorded themselves. That's probably what he meant by the scene unfolding before them now. Perhaps this so-called divine pronouncement was not one of redemption, but of destruction. Let's first listen to the revelation. Let's see what command the deity will issue at a time like this. Looking at the composed high priest, the people around him were influenced and fell silent. To the common folk, this scene meant the high priest had known all along that the gods would respond. Only the ordinary priests were unaware. This deepened their trust, as it was only natural for the high priest to be more powerful. Thus, the crowd soon returned to a state of solemn silence, quietly awaiting the outcome. Time ticked by, and as the sun began to tilt, the great doors of the temple finally opened once more. The chief celebrant, who had been tasked with leading the ritual, staggered out, leaning on the door. For some reason, his steps were unsteady. What did the revelation say? Seeing the chief celebrant emerge from behind the doors, Mammon was the first to speak. High priest, The chief celebrant took a deep breath. His demeanor was not the joy people expected. His hands trembled slightly, and in his palm, he clutched a token cast in gold with intricate patterns carved into it. Though tranquil at heart, his expression grew grim. Mammon stepped forward to take the token from the hands of the speechless chief celebrant. The other did not resist, and the moment the token left his grasp, he collapsed to the ground as if losing his support. Mammon made no reaction to this scene, for as soon as the token was in his hand, the content of the revelation was transmitted into his heart. Silently digesting the information, Mammon soon understood why the other had not come out of the temple sooner and why he behaved in such a fashion now. For those unaware of the truth, this scenario was indeed hard to accept. But for those who knew, Mammon only saw the god's ruthlessness. However, that was normal. He wasn't exactly a good person himself. At some point, the previously clear sky began to be obscured by clouds, blocking the sun holding the golden token. Mammon slowly turned around. All eyes in the crowd focused on him. The joy from receiving the revelation had vanished. Now, looking at the chief celebrant fallen on the ground, they knew the result was probably not favorable. Perhaps the gods did not wish to save them, and this golden token was their rejection. Ladies and gentlemen, the gods have sent down a revelation, which I shall read on their behalf. Facing the crowd's gazes, Mammon looked somber, yet resolute.